Our next speaker is Yadro development expert, 30 years in the industry, and this 30 years. Since 2015, he's been coding with Go. A lot of people Go fans. You see. Okay, and he is head of the Golang Conf program committee, Daniil Podolsky.
Сегодня поговорим про программную архитектуру.
So we will talk about program architecture. Yes, we will talk about program architecture.
Коллеги,
Okay.
Меня зовут Даниил Подольский.
Colleagues, I'm Daniil Podolsky, and I will talk about pragmatic architecture today.
Golang евангелист вам сказал ведущий.
Our anchor has told you about my Yadro employment and that I am Golang evangelist. Yadro makes equipment for data centers and for mobile carriers, and we hire people, of course. Okay, you've been unlucky. I put this presentation together about a year ago, but the conference failed to materialize, and it used to have schemes, code examples, and how to organize Go modules and packages, right? But within a year, I had to refabricate it a little bit, and today it's a motivational speech, and the last sentence in my speech will tell you why I'm doing this, what I'm doing at this stage actually. Okay.
Давайте вот для начала,
How it works.
что такое архитектура.
So,
Для меня лично.
let's start with what architecture is.
Вот это здание.
For me, architecture is like this building, Sagrada Familia, cathedral in Barcelona. It's a fascinating site built by Gaudi, the genius of architecture. And I think this is one of the architecturally best functioning buildings in the world, if you take only new ones, because its main function is to attract tourists, right? And it fulfills that function in a great fashion. How he did it? He did it like this. So pieces of string with some load, and then he puts a mirror underneath, and this is how this Sagrada Familia cathedral came into being. And I'm afraid that actually we program architects do more or less the same thing. We cannot put building blocks one on top of another. Other people do that. We have pieces of string, we have kind of loads on those pieces of string, and we end up with a structure which doesn't actually look very much like a cathedral, but only when we put a mirror underneath, we only then will see that, in fact, this thing does fulfill its function. Now, why architecture is important? What it is it that architects do? Because we need to control complexity. Phil has talked about that. Anyone who will talk to you about architecture will tell you that. Our task is to make something complex work simply. How we do that? It's our headache. It's not the business headache. It's not the coder's headache. We need to take a complicated task and do our intellectual work to make this task as simple and straightforward as possible. So we have to overcome the human existential solitude to make people create a software product together. In one of my previous presentations, I talked a lot about what existential solitude is and why there is no way to cope with this. Because it's existential. You can't ask why are we so lonely and what to do about it. You can't ask those questions because This is something that is inherent in human beings. A human being is lonely by default. And in order to make two human beings work together, you need an architect in the world of software. And this is a quote from the Clean Architecture book. Clean architecture is the possibility to plan actually making business decisions for as late as possible. Businesses, especially startups, they don't like making very definite decisions because it is very expensive to make a definite decision early on and later find out that you're out of the market. So businesses want to make decisions as late as possible, and the architect's task is actually to make sure it happens. Now, what architecture isn't? Architecture does not translate into your code performance. For example, with very bad architecture, you may have a very quickly working application. It will be a plate of spaghetti all along, but it will work quickly. However, good architecture translates into the speed of development. Speed of development is horizontal scaling. We parse a task into small pieces, and everybody writes their own piece, and then we want to put it back together. If your architecture is good, you can work in this way. If your architecture is bad, your pieces will remain pieces. If your project is a long-term project, architecture really translates into whether the support of your project will be cheap or expensive. So it does not depend on the quality of code. It does not depend on the quality of hardware. It does not even depend on the pattern of architecture. So whether your architect has done a good job actually means that you're not going to spend a lot of money on support. I actually work for a company for which the cost of support is a viability issue for the entire business. This is why I'm making such a big focus on it. Now, what architecture is, no one knows. There is no such thing as the description of software architecture. There is no such thing as a definition of civil construction architecture, but we're not concerned about that. If you are an experienced developer and you have seen this type of architecture, that type of architecture, so if you have kind of jumped over this abyss, you may work as an architect, but actually, I met juniors who think that you can read about architecture in a book. Well, that's not the approach that I have seen materializing. Some people think that there are books that make everything clear. Well, there are some books, but they don't make everything clear. And why they don't? Because actually no one reads them, but even when people read them, so my presentation is actually based on two books, the Clean Architecture and Eric Evans's ADD book. I think they call it a blue book or whatever. So they have red, blue, and green. So green is a short description of the red and so on. So all the literature on architecture, which we are witnessing, according to the great scientific tradition of the 20th century, all these books avoid pushing the reader. They are not designed for propaganda. They are not designed for putting a certain idea into the reader's head. Scientific literature today is about giving information, giving hypothesis to a person reading the literature, and the person actually makes their own decisions. And this is exactly what doesn't happen, this last bit.
Практически не удается
Analysis
никому,
is
мне, например, так
available,
и не удался.
but very few people, if anyone, are capable of synthesis on the back of that analysis. I, for example, have failed to do this. Whatever I understand about architecture,
Помогли мне очень, даже немножко помешали.
I think I had to grow and build myself. Both books that I've been referring to, they actually stood in the way. So the problem is, what is the metaphor of clean architecture? Everybody knows what clean architecture is, even if you have not read the book. However, this metaphor is not exactly very successful, in fact, because this picture is the only thing that remains in people's heads after they read the book. I actually reread my slides when I prepared for this presentation, and I understood that about 3/4 of the material I had read actually vanished, and I don't remember anything. So who remembers what is the beginning of clean architecture? Okay? The first chapter is that good architecture is expensive, but bad architecture is even more costly. And this is the key thing, and I have we'll go back to that. So architecture is the part of software development that is directly related to money. And this picture is actually the closest thing you have to synthesis from this book. This is why it remains in people's heads. Writing other books maybe could qualify as propaganda, and of course, as propaganda, these books will be banned. Why? Because clean architecture is a metaphor that wakes up readers' fantasy to make sure that a pretty complicated idea gets through to the reader. It was actually not very clearly formulated in the first place. So the author had to use this metaphor and illustrate this metaphor with a picture. The metaphor just didn't fly. The picture is the only thing people still have. And this is why we need another metaphor. And this is why I will use the metaphor of pragmatic, quote-unquote, pragmatic architecture. Pragmatic means that it will always use the cost-to-benefit analysis at every step. We all remember that clean architecture starts with money. It even has a diagram tells you that the first 10,000 lines of code are cheap. The next 10,000 lines are a little bit more expensive, but after the first 100,000 lines of code, those projects were pretty small. Actually, you would need a lot of money to add something sizable to an already big project.
Из этого определения прагматичности следует определение. Я пробовал много раз в разных чатах.
So this is why I use the word pragmatic. I actually asked a lot of people what good architecture is, and the responses that I get are but good architecture makes money, bad architecture loses money. And if you read anything about software architecture, the only description is making money or losing money, but it does not help us because we cannot quantify it. In fact, if we have a successful product, we don't know which part of success was provided by architecture. If we have a failing product, there are some ways to quantify which part of the losses the architecture is responsible for. But on the positive side, I don't think we can. And our task is actually prospective. Some tasks are introspective. Right? We need to look into something in order to fulfill the task. there are some retrospective tasks. We need to look back into where exactly we failed in the past, but architecture is a prospective task. We need to imagine a world in which our product will be successful. And actually, I'm not a prophet, therefore I don't know how to solve prospective tasks and problems, and there is no mathematical model for the future. And actually, what helps a code developer in this way is fantasy, right? So we cannot quantify how much money we make. So what are the indicators of a pragmatic architecture? So you look at your architecture and you want to tell yourself whether it is pragmatic, quote unquote, or not. So the first identifier is that your pragmatic architecture allows you not to say no to your business. For example, your founder comes to you and says, hey, we have a bright idea. And you say, no, 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 we can't do what you're asking because our architecture is already about microservices. So the rarer you say no to your business, the better. So if you work for a startup which has been in existence for at least half a year, you can do that. A pragmatic architecture is understandable to coders. We all remember about existential solitude, yes? So you are not the cheapest person on the team, so you need to spend as little time as possible to explain to the code developers what to do. So if you don't have to explain it 10 times, 5 times, you're good. If 3 times, you're a genius of pragmatic architecture. And this actually makes it understandable why code developers don't like books about architecture. Because what you do is, well, I'm going to come back to this. You formulate your architecture, you bring that to the code developers. You may have read the book about user stories. You have not, you know what a repository is. Actually, you are at the same level of intellectual level with your coders. Okay, you can continue, but if you are the only person who have read the BDD book in your company, you'd better forget all those terms because you'll be the only one who understands you. It also says on the slide that architecture is art. I will not enlarge on this, that actually this problem has been in active debate for over 300 years. Philosophers in the new time have come to the conclusion that art is the only way of overcoming the existential solitude. So architecture is art. It is not a trade, and it is much less of a science that people think. So why pragmatic architecture? Because a pragmatic architecture makes sure that a project starts cheaply. Even if you don't work for a startup who wants to hit the market within a month with a principally new product, you need to start fast and you need to start cheap. And we go back to Phil's presentation. Use a minimum stack of technologies. If you bring a Kafka in your project, your architecture becomes, well, not worse, but less pragmatic. You need to
Что такое дешевое масштабирование? Это разделение
Start
труда
cheaply
дешевое.
and scale
Это
cheaply.
простое разделение на модули. Об
Cheap
этом мы
scaling
отдельно поговорим,
is
почему
simple distribution of
разделение на
labor,
модули это важно.
simple
И вам
modularization.
важно
I'll
обеспечить
come back to simple
своему делищу
modularization,
устойчивость.
and
Устойчивость в терминах
reliability and
математических.
resilience.
Устойчивая функция – это функция
So you
малого
have to
изменения аргумента, который
really
приводит
make
всегда
sure that
приводит к
your
малому
function
изменению
is
результата.
resilient
То есть
when a
если у вас
small
вы
change in your
заменили
argument
клиента
means a
с хлеба
small
на
change in
могилку,
the result of the
вы
function.
не должны
So if
перестраивать весь
your
ваш
client
архитектурный
changes
ящик.
from web to mobile,
Вы должны
that
иметь
does not mean
возможность
that you
сделать это малой
should
кровью.
architecturally
А,
change the
Это
entire
очень
stack.
важный
You need to
параметр. Я
actually be able
упомяну, почему.
to change things at your own pace
Значит,
and small things.
если
And this is very important.
использовать
I'll come back to
художественную
why
метафору,
it is important.
то
Again,
прагматичная архитектура
using
сводит
an
ваш новый
artistic
проект
metaphor,
к старому
a
успешному.
pragmatic
Вот
architecture
вы знаете,
makes
был
that your
такой успешный
new
проект, а вот
project is
лучше
very much
способа
like your
решить
old successful project. So you have a history
перспективную
of a
задачу.
successful project, and you are
Перспективную
now
задачу нет
dealing
способа
with a
решить
prospective problem. Yes?
из
Okay.
головы. Но вы можете воспользоваться старым опытом, у вас есть проект, он
So if you
выстрелил,
can
вы
take
знаете, как вы его
the
делали,
successful body
давайте
of
новый
work from the
проект сведем к
past,
старому. Станет лучше.
your architecture is
Не
pragmatic
провальному
if you
проекту.
can
Провальных проектов у нас в жизни у каждого
reuse your
существенно больше,
successful
чем
projects from the past and avoid reusing your
поэтому
failed
это
projects
сделать
from the
еще
past. Of
немножко
course,
проще.
everybody
Давайте
has much
поймем,
more failed
как
projects
наши...
than
Ну,
successful
вот
projects. So
прагматично будет об этом подумать на этапе
it
разработки
would be
архитектуры.
pragmatic
Как
to
мне
think
сделать
about this
такой же
in the very
проект, который
start,
уже
how to make
как тот,
sure
который уже
that I
провалился.
reuse my good experience and not reuse my bad
И
experience.
очень важно. Об этом
And
написано, кажется, в 4
important,
главе чистой
and I
архитектуры.
think
Очень важно,
it's
чтобы ваша
chapter 4
архитектура
of Clean
позволяла
Architecture is about that.
достаточно просто
It's
понять, что вы
important to make sure
неправильно
that
реализовали
your architecture
задачу,
gives you
не соблюли
very
технические
quickly
требования. На
the
самом деле,
idea that
основная
someone
претензия
has
к
done
монолитной
their job
архитектуре
wrong
в том, что
during code
слишком
development.
большой объем информации
The
необходимо
biggest
проанализировать, чтобы
disadvantage
понять,
of
правильно
monolithic
работает система или
architecture
нет,
is
соответствует
that you
она
need to
архитектурной
consume a lot of
документации и
information to
требованиям или
understand
нет.
whether your system works right
Поэтому
or not, whether it is true to the architectural design or whether it has
разрабатывать
digressed at a certain
архитектуру с
point.
учетом того, что мы
So
потом
when
будем
you
доказывать
think of
на том
the
или ином этапе
architecture of your project
разработки,
in the first place, you need to
что
keep in
наша
mind what
реализация
you're going to say
соответствует
when
требованиям.
you
Здесь есть
prove
фраза
at a
про
certain
наша
stage
деятельность
that your
недедуктивна. Дело в том, что
implementation
в дедуктивных системах,
your
например, в математике,
implementation
мы можем пройти
actually
одним
is
единственным
true
путем
to the
или
requirement
несколькими путями, это
specification.
не важно, от
Deductively in
постулов
mathematics,
до выводов. И
there are always several
дедуктивные системы
ways,
устроены таким
several
образом, что
journeys possible
истинность выводов
between
зависит только от истинности
your
постулов. Внутри там аристотелева логика, все должно
between
получиться
your initial
автоматически. Так вот,
and
наша
your
задача не
final
дедуктивная.
thesis,
Наши
between the thesis
системы,
and
в
conclusion.
которых мы
And
оперируем
the
нашей
rest is just governed by
нашей
Aristotle's
разработкой,
logic.
не
So
дедуктивны,
any
поэтому
journey
доказать это просто,
will work
взяв
if it
и
starts
изучив
with
весь
A
исходный
and
код,
ends
не
with B.
получится.
In
Это
our
придется делать
case,
интуитивно,
you will have to do it intuitively. You cannot say that whatever works, if it
Прагматичная
brings me
архитектура
from
на
A to B, it's
Значит,
good. No,
Это
you have
маргинальная
to
мысль, она
use the
никому
best
не
way.
нравится, но я ее
So what is pragmatic
пытаюсь
architecture in the
пропагандировать
real
уже
world?
несколько лет. Все
I've
проекты
been telling
одинаковые,
this
все
for
проекты
several years
устроены вот
now.
так. А
Very
именно,
few
есть
people
у проекта
believe me,
пользователь,
but all
есть
projects
приложение,
are
в
the
котором есть
same.
бизнес-логика и
There's the
хранилище.
user,
Бизнес-логика
there's
обрабатывает
the
данные от
business layer,
пользователя,
and
складывает их
the
в
repository.
хранилище,
The
и все
business
работает.
user gets data from the business layer gets data from the user and keeps them in the repository.
Иногда
And
нам
this is how
кажется, что у
everything
нас
works.
есть более
Sometimes
сложные
we may
проекты.
think
Но
that
смотрите, они
projects
все сводятся
work
вот к
in a
такой
more
системе.
complicated
У нас
way,
есть или
but
пользователь, или другое
they
приложение,
all
или очередь,
really use either a user or another application, or they'll talk to you about queues, and there is a repository, and there is an effector that does something in the system, and so on and so forth. There may be another application that we talk to, and there may be a queue to record the results. But it's the same application, actually. So it has the initiator rectangle. This is the answer to the question, what do we do if our business logic ought to do something on its own initiative? And this is where architect's job starts. So I made a decision as an architect. I decided that my initiator, which starts a certain task without another application or without a user commanding us to do so, it will be a specific module within the application, and it will be treated as a user. And this is pragmatic. Why I do that? Because all projects are the same. And this architecture actually makes it possible for me to reuse that solution in any other project. And this is exactly where we start to talk in earnest about pragmatic architecture. So any architecture should be three-tier. People tell me that it's a fringe idea, but adapters of incoming information, business logic, and adapters of outgoing information. It's pragmatic, it's adaptive, it's simple, straightforward, and actually this is something that reuses good body of work and avoids reusing bad body of work. Well, actually, I do know a lot of failed projects with three-tier architecture, but nonetheless, any architecture can be boiled down to a three-tier architecture. So any big number of layers can be again boiled down to 3 layers or 3 tiers, which you can see in the screen. Going back to the book. In fact, the left-hand picture and the right-hand picture are identical. They actually convey the same idea, but not exactly the same idea. Now, what's the difference?
No.
Does it work anyway?
О.
No.
Значит, почему не совсем? Потому что существует проблема зависимости, про нее
not exactly the same. Because there is a problem of dependencies. Phil talked about that. So you have modules. Within a module, you have submodules, and the submodules depend on other submodules. Submodules depend on modules, and so on. These are logical dependencies you can't do without. So the same story as the story about producer and consumer. Formally, they are not related because the producer writes something into a message queue, and the consumer reads from the message queue, and there is no direct communication. However, structurally and in terms of the internal expectations, they are related, and you can't do anything about it. This is the nature of what we work with. And maybe this is the biggest problem that stands in the way of everybody making good software. So these are the dependencies, and these dependencies should be reflected in your code. So this idea that the producer has written into the message queue and the consumer has read from the message queue and they are not related, this is a destructive idea. And you'd better not use it, because it actually conceals the existing connection, and you can see this connection only when your system has gone live. And looking at a live system, trying to understand how it works is not pragmatic. And with this kind of thing, you will have to do it, because always people who have not written your code will have to read your code.
Проблема зависимости – это иерархия управления.
And actually, your dependency problem comes from the management hierarchy. So you have a client, you have a server, and we are so used to client-server architecture that actually you would have a hard time describing anything else to a coder. So when you call an architectural meeting, everybody thinks you will talk about queries and responses, queries and processing, because, well, the real world is client-server. Maybe this is why human expectations are all about that. However, if you imagine me winding back several slides ago, you will see my scheme. The client is a client for business logic. Your business logic is a client for the repository. This is natural relationship, and you can't do anything about this natural relationship, and therefore in your code you should not even try to conceal it. That's the idea. It doesn't work very well.
Да, тут должен быть еще слайд вот с той картинкой из чистой архитектуры.
There should be another slide with the same picture from clean architecture. Don't try to show the business logic that it does not depend on the repository. Your business logic is the client for your repository, and so when you code, you should not conceal it. Well, as a Go evangelist, I will spend 30 seconds on the same problem in Go, where it is worse than in many other languages. We don't have covariance or contravariance in Go. So we will always have to mention the derivative types from a specific module. So we will have to import a specific package into our code, writing any module. And of course, this chain of imports should import the management hierarchy, importing structures from the repository, because business logic as a client depends on the repository. Actually, these are faint traces of the first version of my presentation. And this is in absolute contravention to what clean architecture tells you, that it says that your business logic is your sacred cow and everything else is details of implementation. And that is true, but your implementation will have to work in accordance with how the real world works. The business logic is not a server for everyone. The business logic is a client for something else, right? So it is like the light, the particle and the wave at the same thing. So business logic is business logic, but at the same time, it does depend on details of implementation. It's not funny, but at the same thing, it is true. Eric Evans writes a lot about the domain dependencies and how to design for them and how to take them into account. And I always do like I've written on this slide, because this is pragmatic, because if you do not like this, you will break the brain of all the developers who will have to read one another's code. You can't put those management hierarchical structures into a specific package. you need not to be afraid of conversions. In Go, for example, there are not a lot of people in Go, but it's important that you shouldn't conceal any real-world relationships. So this is an algorithm for an architect to make something pragmatic. Step one, try to describe your problem in terms of a three-tier architecture. Why three-tier architecture? Just because, I promise you, if your specific project does not fit into three-tier architecture, try to imagine three-tier architecture for it. Step two, try to figure in some additional space for additional tasks. The business will be good. The business will develop further. Talk to founder, visionaries, or whatever. Again, you need to leave some space in terms of a three-tier architecture, and it will be pragmatic, because in half a year, your founders will come and say, yes, we have a bright new idea, and you already have this space, this expanse for it. And describing three-tier architecture needs to be done to an appropriate depth. What is an appropriate depth? The appropriate depth is when programmers, code developers understand architects. It's not the issue of qualification, right? It's the question of role. So your role today is cook food for everyone. Your role today is draw an architecture for everyone. Your role today is to actually implement that architecture. Of course, at a certain point, some programmers reveal that they are good at drawing architectures, and this is what they start doing. And if someone asks a question during the meeting, and what happens in there? You need to go to drill down into that layer and again draw a three-tier architecture there. So when we draw those rectangles, what you do, you document handovers. You document who is whose server and client. I recommend C4 model. So who knows what a C4 model is? Oh, everybody knows. Well, not everyone, but half of you know. And if you don't know, Google it. There is a 14-minute video from the author of this concept, and then in your next presentation, you will be in a great position to raise your hand, because it is very easy to understand. So even though the C4 model was devised to draw architectures, from my experience, it is impossible to draw an architecture with the C4 model, because what we have drawn so far is analytics. We have finished analyzing our project, so we are ready to create an architecture. So only this, right? Only this is the basement for the architecture. Architecture is who and when hands over to whom. Who is whose server, who is whose client. And this is a full, unequivocal, and exhaustive model. If anyone asks you, and what happens if, you will need to look into your architecture, and you will need to be able to say, yes, okay, if this happens, the error will be generated by this module, the error will go there, and this is how it ends. And this also is rigid and finite. I don't remember exactly, but I think chapter 2 in Clean Architecture tells you that the way of the architect is the way of limitation. So Dijkstra was the first who said, don't use go-to, right? But anyway, even if you don't look that far back,
Помните об этом.
you're not the best friend of your code developers when you draw an architecture for them, because you create restrictions for them.
Там есть ремарками читать не вредно.
And the third thing is that architecture should be formulated in understandable execution terms. I don't know how to do that. Because, for example, you are an architect, you keep the entire model in your head.
Или картинками.
But there is very little chance actually you can convey this in words or in pictures. And I don't know what to do about it. This is where intuitive understanding comes into play, but there is no such thing as an algorithm. I can do that, I don't have this experience, and I have never seen an architecture drawn or described in a way that makes it immediately understandable to coders. And architectures cannot be described in C4 terms. So this model that you keep in your hand, there are some instruments to draw this. Arrows of this kind, that kind, and rectangles of this kind or that kind. I especially like this when there is an arrow going from the upper right-hand corner to the bottom left-hand corner, and the meaning of this arrow depends on how this arrow starts and how it ends, right? So normally, you can draw such a model in UML, and there are some instruments, but this model will not be understandable. I have tried this. I read the UML textbook from A to Z, and I drew a pretty simple microservices architecture. No chance. People did not even look at it. So you can try to describe it in plain language, but you have to be good at storytelling. I'm not good enough at storytelling to describe my architectures in plain language. That's the reality. So, what to do about this? You need to think of module-to-module interfaces. Why it is important that the system is split into modules. I talked about that in the beginning. Because our system will be described as a system of interfaces between modules. So, from my experience, of course, describing interfaces is not a model, it is the first derivative of such a model, but this first derivative makes people understand much better how the model you're trying to describe is supposed to work, much better than just drawing in UML. So you describe module-to-module interfaces, and this is your best chance to make your architecture understandable. I recommend Proto 3 format. A lot of people know it as gRPC, but gRPC is actually one of the instances. Proto 3 is a good format, and I even think that for libraries that do not communicate over the network, the interfaces should still be described within the Proto 3 format, because this is a very rigid format. It requires documentation, it requires validation, and so on and so forth. So it's really healthy to try to introduce this in my team. I'm going to do that, and I'll tell you within a year whether I've succeeded. So there is another thing that the architecture should do is to make sure that module-to-module interfaces are consistent always consistent with the model that the architect keeps in their head, which remains not understandable by everything else, but it is his job to ensure full consistency of the interfaces with the model of management handover. So this is what they're being paid for.
И следующий заход. Мы, используя имеющиеся у нас материалы, популяризируем модель.
Using our materials, of course, this is next step, step 4.
Которую мы создали, собственно, архитектуру.
You popularize or you propagandize your model among colleagues. Everybody should understand it to a certain extent. Everybody should accept it, all the way down to the last June who... of course, this is a stretch target. Almost never you can succeed in that, but you should aspire to that. And last but not least, an architecture is not a UML diagram. It is not even a model in my head. It is an idea that has become a material force by being understood by the masses, as Karl Marx used to say. What is a meme? It is not a picture with a witty caption. A meme is a picture with a witty caption that people keep on forwarding to one another. An architecture is not a drawing, is not a graph, is not a description. It is something that brings your team together, right? No less than that. And that ends my presentation. Thank you very much. If you have questions, please let me know.
Так, у нас, я смотрю, вот есть вопросы. Давайте тогда микрофончики.
So we have some questions. Philip, you will have to wait.
Первый микрофончик и сразу вот сюда второй микрофончик.
We have 1-2 microphones here in the first row.
Доклад было интересно.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Kirill from Ozantech.
У меня вообще, на самом деле, много вопросов, но задам самый интересный про деньги.
Question about money.
Архитектура выходит за рамки прагматичности.
How do you understand
чтобы понять пораньше и там побольше.
which tool tells you that your architecture is becoming less pragmatic? Well, actually, saving money is the same as making money. So the answer is I don't know, and no one knows. Because when we create architectures, we are prophets. And this is not a self-fulfilling prophecy. We don't know. So we don't know. This is the answer.
Бэклогу команды или там по
Looking at the backlog from the team will help. Well, you can look at your previous jobs. For example, we have brought a Kafka into an old project, and we actually tried to set it up for 2 months, and we ran out of our budget, so we don't use the Kafka, okay? Next question, please.
Спасибо за доклад. Жуков Виктор, компания Scala-R.
Victor Zhukov, Scala-R.
Как распространить архитектуру в голову всей команды?
How do you propagate your architecture into the heads of everyone on the team, including the Junes? Can you share this successful way of cross-fertilization? Well, I use an algorithm. I draw the pictures in C4.
Например, секвенс-диаграммы практически всегда рисую.
And I almost always draw sequence diagrams, for example. I survey all the Junes, whether they have understood the task, and I fix all the module-to-module interfaces in Proto 3. So while someone reads the Proto 3, they will have to understand why it has to be that way. It leaves very little for artistic self-realization. Well, it works for me anyway. You can use a knife or a fork to open a tin, and both will work.
Да.
And if it's not a Go project,
одно из самых главных его достоинств.
Proto 3, well, Proto 3 is a ubiquitous format, and I think this is what's good about it. Thank you for the presentation. Sergey Tarasenko, I'm independent. Can you go back to slide 13?
Пощелкаем.
Слайд 13.
Да.
Отлично.
Вот. Здесь у меня небольшой
Okay.
разрыв шаблона произошел.
So here I do see some inconsistency, and I was waiting for the explanation.
И здесь написано, что прагматичная архитектура.
So it tells me that a pragmatic architecture, it's about cheap start.
Чем быстрее на старте, тем больше потом.
But the quicker you are at the start, the more expensive
Я
it
читал об
is.
этом доклад год назад на Saint Hilo.
Well,
Может быть, вы
that's
скажете,
because that's the
как
trace of my previous presentation.
между тем, чтобы
So
дешевый
how do you balance between
это иногда overhead
cheap
на
start?
начале кажется, а потом оказывается,
So
что
when
нет.
brokers are introduced, they look like an overhead in the beginning.
Когда вы разрабатываете
Well, my answer is a modular monolith.
только не строите микросервисную
When you
архитектуру.
develop
В смысле,
like
не
you would be
микросервисную инфраструктуру,
developing
простите,
a microservice infrastructure, but you're not making a microservice infrastructure.
Вы можете
With Go, you can do
монолитно
that.
выделить в отдельный программный
You
модуль,
can
так, чтобы импортировать из него,
create a
его
module
детали реализации
out
было
of
невозможно,
a
а можно было
monolith
только пользоваться публичным его API.
so that
Вот так и
it
строите.
cannot import anything apart from
Времени на
what
вопросы
its
очень много,
public
поэтому
API.
Сейчас сначала вот молодой человек
allows
в
it to
футболке,
do.
а потом будет Филипп.
Вот, Кирилл,
So
сказал,
Philip
вот,
comes
вы сказали,
after
что
this young man.
Для GON требуется чуть-чуть
So,
изменить стандарт
You said that for a Go project, you need to change the standards of architecture. So how do you persuade architects who come from other languages that this is the right idea? Well, there is no way to do
Не
that
признает,
until a person
Go как реальность свою новую.
admits that their new reality is Go. Now, you're in hell,
Что можно же
and
обойтись
this is your new life.
без
Welcome.
грязных хаков не получится.
Before you persuade them that you can do without dirty hacks,
Так страдают от этого разработчики, а не архитекторы.
but it's not architects who bear the brunt of the problem. It's the developers. Well, I told you that the way of the samurai is death.
Вот молодой человек в зеленой кепке вот там вот будет с вопросом.
Я у тебя больше видел в картинке про функциональные требования.
So I have seen pictures from about the functional requirements, but not the functional requirements themselves. How do you draw them? How do you actually draft them in your architecture?
Зимой мастер-класс по сбору нефункциональных требований.
Last winter, we had a masterclass with Phil on how to collect non-functional requirements.
Нефункциональные требования немедленно превращаются в функциональные.
Non-functional requirements turn into functional requirements from the pragmatic standpoint.
Производительность, а на деньги.
When you start looking at money rather than anything else,
Еще вчера нефункциональными, сегодня стали
you immediately recognize that what used to be non-functional requirements yesterday become functional requirements tomorrow.
Потом вот здесь вот чуть-чуть дальше, и потом с той стороны.
Здравствуйте, спасибо за доклад. Иван Балагуров.
Thank you for the presentation.
У меня вопрос.
Иван Балагуров,
Практическая
Kaspersky Labs.
архитектура, она равна поддерживаемой архитектуре?
So,
Потому что
is this pragmatic architecture equal to easily supportable architecture?
усложнение ее, они как раз про
Because making architecture more complicated, I think it's about the ways to support it. Well, a practical architecture is a metaphor that I'm trying to use to break the ice of miscomprehension. Of course, supportability is a requirement of pragmaticity. And actually, we are looking at cheap scaling. When you want to have a larger team, you hire 3 more developers, you already have 10, and they look at your documentation and they don't get into a coma as they read it. This is one of the requirements, but this is not equal because pragmatic or practical, I think there are some other requirements too, but
Так, вот здесь сейчас
it's as
молодой
good as it
человек,
gets.
пожалуйста. И
Здравствуйте.
потом будет вопросик вот там.
Спасибо за доклад. Влад Афанасьев,
Yeah.
компания
Hello,
«Цифра».
Vlad Afanasyev from Cifra.
Есть прям куча определений архитектуры, и
There are a lot of
это отражает. Ну вот я как-то услышал, к
descriptions
сожалению, не
of
помню, где такое
architecture,
определение.
and
Архитектура — это то, что
one
нельзя
I
нагуглить.
heard is that
Как вам такое
architecture is
определение?
something you
Рабочее
can't
оно? Можно им
Google.
пользоваться?
Do you think it's workable?
Справедливое определение, только оно нам
Yes.
ничего не дает. Как и любое
It's
другое
a
апофатическое
fair
определение.
description,
Если,
but it doesn't give you anything in the real world.
то
If architecture is something that you can't, what is your
Нужно
conclusion as
разворачивать,
well?
там, прям раскрыть
Да,
большую
апофатические
балладу.
определения, это, кстати,
Yes,
учтите. Когда будете
apophatic
излагать свою
descriptions,
архитектуру коллегам,
and when you try
апофатические
to
определения
persuade
не
colleagues
Спасибо
in
за ответ.
your architecture, apophatic
Спасибо.
descriptions
Так,
just don't
сейчас
work.
молодой человек вот с той стороны, пожалуйста. Если есть руки, поднимайте.
Привет. Большое спасибо за доклад. Вопрос такой.
Yeah, hello and
Есть
thanks.
C4, а есть сетевая схема. Как
So,
подружить,
there is C4 and network scheme.
не перегрузить
How
одну
to make
другой?
these two entities friends without overloading?
Видите, это прям хороший вопрос. Это прям
Well, that's a great
кандидат на
question,
лучший
actually.
вопрос. Честно
I
вам
mean,
скажу.
that's a
Честно
candidate
вам
for
скажу,
best
я не
question.
знаю ответа. Давайте так.
I'll tell you honestly,
Дело
I
в
don't
том, что
know,
действительно,
I don't
как
have a
только
good
ты
answer for it.
начинаешь использовать C4 для изложения
When
именно
you
архитектуры,
start using
пусть даже и
C4 to
сетевой,
describe
да,
your architecture,
инфраструктуры, например, ты
network
неверно
infrastructure or
сталкиваешься с
something else,
ограничениями этого формата. Он предназначен для
you run
митингов,
into
для
the
того,
restrictions
чтобы
of this
сопроводить
format. This format is for
презентацию какими-то
meetings,
картинками.
for
C4 на самом деле не для
making
такой
pictures
серьезной
to your
работы не
presentations.
предназначено.
C4 is not designed
И
for
как их
anything,
подружить,
you know,
я не знаю.
serious.
Я
And I don't
обычно
know how
рисую одно
to
и
make them
второе и
friends.
кладу их рядом.
I normally
Хорошо, спасибо.
make both and put them
Спасибо.
together,
У
kind of.
меня тогда... так вот, давайте вот сейчас ваш вопрос, а потом мой вопрос.
Okay, two more questions. Thank you. I'm Anton, ITMO University. So pragmatic architecture, on the one hand, make sure that businesses can ask questions at a later stage, but at the same time, you try to use Proto 3, a very rigid protocol. Somewhat of an inconsistency. Well, there is no inconsistency. Module-to-module interface descriptions is very far from business applications.
Его расширять без потери совместимости.
And you can scale this format without loss of compatibility.
Тем, что вам придется совместимость уничтожать.
You'll have to think about compatibility all the time, but otherwise there is no inconsistency. I mean,
Два вопроса. Первый вопрос: используете ли вы какие-то паттерны в своей деятельности, типа шаблоны, стандартные наборы?
do you use patterns or
Архитектура и безопасность.
standard stacks?
Сразу думать
And
о безопасности или
the second question is architecture and security.
Значит, во-первых,
When do you start thinking about security? Before architecture or after?
Как вас зовут?
And could you please identify yourself?
Мегафон, Дмитрий.
Dmitry from Megaphone.
значит,
Yes, that's a great question. Another candidate for best question.
про безопасность. Думать
I'll
про
start with
безопасность,
security.
когда разрабатываешь архитектуру, очень трудно.
It's very hard to think about security when you're building architecture.
Отдельный человек.
So it's best
Точно так же,
to
как ревью собственного
have
кода
a
невозможно
specific person
Точно так же невозможно
think about
обеспечить
architecture.
безопасность,
It's impossible to review your own code,
для
and
себя.
it's
Ну,
impossible
эта проблема, она
to
существует,
make
да.
your code
Писатель не
secure
может
for
вычитать,
yourself.
сделать корректуру собственного текста. Для
So
этого
a
нанимает отдельного
writer
человека.
just cannot correct their own texts. And this is, I think, the metaphor that works for security. Together, business architect and security architect can make a deal, right? What was the first question? Yes, patterns. Yes, I do. I use them, but I never call them that. The more terminology, the less comprehensible it is, especially for junior colleagues. I need dialogue with junior colleagues, and if you overload them with terms, it's not good.
Поблагодарим нашего докладчика.
Okay, let's thank our presenter.